Hi there, I'm Stacey Lindsay, a co-host of the Scarlet Society podcast. Today, my guest is Athena Lamnisos. Athena is the CEO of the Eve Appeal, a national charity based in the UK that's raising awareness around gynecological cancers for women, trans men, and non-binary individuals. Now, here's a sobering fact. In the US, 33,000 people die of a gynecologic cancer every year. And so many of us don't even know what to ask our doctors. I, for one, didn't even realize there are 5 gynecologic cancers, as ovarian cancer gets all the spotlight. Athena and I talk about all of this and so much more. We talk about what to know, what to ask our doctors, how we can start to break the stigma around learning about gynecologic cancers and our health, and the preventative care to know. Athena is an absolute wealth of information, and she's a true warrior for our health. So here's my conversation with Athena Lamnisos. I'm here with Athena Lamnisos, CEO of the Eve Appeal. Athena, thank you so much for spending time with us.
You're welcome. Always happy to talk about gynecological issues.
Let's dive in. I have so many questions. And as I was saying to you earlier, too, just learning more about the Eve Appeal and your mission, I've learned so much just about my health and things I need to be aware of. Starting out, the Eve Appeal, you're a national charity. You're based in the UK. You're raising awareness around gynecological cancers for women, trans men, non-binary individuals. Athena, talk us through what your mission is in your work.
Yeah, sure. So there are 5 gynecological cancers, and that always surprises everyone. 5. You see people kind of trying to count on their hands and kind of going, cervical, what else is there? And that's really dismaying because, 42% of the cancers that affect women are quite specific to us as women. They're hormone-associated cancers, and, breast cancer is included in that. But the gynecological cancers, it's really important for everyone to know about. So the Eve Appeal has a razor-sharp focus on raising awareness of the signs, symptoms, risk factors of those cancers, but also of specifically of raising awareness of the signs and symptoms so you can detect them early. So we're not talking, of course we are talking to people with cancer, but we're not just talking to people with cancer like many other cancer charities and NGOs are. We're talking to everyone about how to stop themselves from getting cancer. And we do mean everyone, because it's really important whether you have a womb or you don't have a womb, that, you will know someone and love someone who does and who you want to look after their health. And one of the very important things about these cancers is that they are surrounded in taboos. People find them hard to talk about. They're underfunded, they're underprofiled. And so talking to everyone makes it that much more important. So in terms of what we do is...
Yeah.
I was just going to go on to say that what we do as a charity, we do 3 things. And we are based in the UK, but the main thing that we fund is medical research. And that's done everywhere. We're funding research in many countries, in academic institutions. The whole mantra of that research is that it's best, it's world class, and that it's focused on what we're focused on, which is prevention, early detection, new screening programs, a lot of work around genetics. You might have heard about the BRCA gene. So quite a lot of people call that the Angelina Jolie gene, because she's quite famously talked about her family history, talked about her genetic mutation. I can come on to talk about genetics some more. But so we do 3 things. We fund medical research, and that's funded not just in the UK, but all over the world. We've got a very big programme at the moment at McGill in Canada, looking at a rare form of ovarian cancer, which affects very young women, usually in their early 20s, late teens to early 20s, a really devastating form of ovarian cancer. The second thing that we do is we run awareness campaigns and education programmes. We've just launched a schools education programme, and we run campaigns through the year around awareness raising. Apologies for my dog. Around awareness raising of signs and symptoms. And then the third thing that we do, and the only direct service that we run, is a nurse service called Ask Eve. We employ gynae oncology specialist nurses, and the whole mantra of that service is it's free to use, it's taboo free, no question is too small, No question is too embarrassing. And the whole point of the service is sometimes people find it much easier to put their question in an email or to speak about it over the telephone rather than talking to a GP, a doctor face to face. And one of the things that you find with the gynecological cancers is that people have noticed that something has changed. They've noticed that there's something that's different, but they've been too embarrassed or they haven't known that it could be a sign or symptom of cancer. So they haven't sought medical help until it's quite late. And as we know with cancer, the later the diagnosis, the poorer the prognosis. So the whole point is to keep people well and to make people really body aware.
It's incredible. And I want to go back and talk about some of the stigma around it and some of the biases when we look at this. I am a cis woman. I was astounded. I didn't realize there are 5
Yeah.
gynecological cancers. And
Yeah.
again, I'm a cis woman, and I want to read some of these very, very upsetting, sobering facts I have here. Here in the US, again, you're based in the UK. I'm in the US. The American Cancer Society estimates there's about 33,000 deaths a year related to gynecological cancers and more than 100,000 cases per year. In the UK, and Athena, please fact check me on this, but 7,700 deaths, is that correct, related to around that gynecological cancers in the UK.
Yeah.
That's astounding. That's upsetting. And you're talking about research is underfunded.
Yeah.
Talk to me about this lack of awareness and what's behind this.
Yeah, sure. I mean, there are lots of different factors behind it. And I mean, in the UK alone, it's about 58 women a day who are diagnosed with a gynecological cancer. And it's so upsetting to think that the first time they've even heard of one of those diseases is when they're sitting in a small white room being told by a doctor in a white coat that they've got one, and they're astounded that they could have got womb cancer or endometrial cancer, as it's often called. So that is really distressing. What's really distressing is that of those 58, 22 of them will die within 5 years. Many of these cancers have a really, really brutal prognosis. Ovarian cancer, particularly, has a really poor prognosis. So low awareness. I mean, there are lots of things, that are around it. But one of the things is we really do find it very difficult to talk about our reproductive anatomy. You find that from the earliest age, people are using euphemisms. They don't really know, they're using euphemisms for part of their body, which is fine if you also know the proper word. But women's bodies are quite different to men's bodies, just by the simple fact that in reproductive anatomy terms, men can just look down or look across in the urinal and you can see a penis and testicles, which is basically what makes up the male reproductive anatomy. For women, it's really quite different. It's either between our legs, so it's hidden, or it's within our pelvises, and it's much more complicated. So the 5 gynecological cancers are vulval cancer, which is on the increase, vaginal cancer, which is the rarest of the gynecological cancers, cervical cancer, which is the one that most people have heard of. I know that you don't have a national cervical screening program in the US, but in the UK we do, and in many countries there is a national screening program. But I think that everyone, to an extent, is aware of screening, even if they don't attend or they can't afford to attend or they're not called to attend and it's not compulsory. They're aware of cervical screening. And cervical cancer is a really interesting case. Cervical cancer is the only theoretically, it's a preventable disease now. It's the only cancer where we can spot cell changes before they're cancerous and intervene. So that's what your cervical screening appointment, sometimes called your pap smear, is for. So you can spot those cell changes before they're cancer. But also, really importantly, we know what the biggest risk factor is. Over 99% of cervical cancers are caused by a virus called HPV. HPV is a risk factor in many other cancers as well. But we can vaccinate against HPV, and that's a really, really powerful thing to be able to do. But what's really depressing in the UK, where we have a free national screening service, is we are at a 30-year all-time low in terms of people going for their attending their cervical screening appointment is astonishing. And then we know there are lots of reasons why different groups don't attend. And I know in the US there are particular groups with communities that don't attend for there are lots of reasons around access, service provision, how the services are configured. But one of the reasons people don't attend, which comes up again and again in research, is they are quite straightforwardly embarrassed about showing their bodies to a medical practitioner. That's just astounding to me. And there's probably more of an embarrassment factor in the UK than other countries where you're used to going to a gynecologist. There's no culture of going to a gynecologist on an annual basis in the UK. The UK system is very much set up that you have one main doctor who's called your GP, your general practitioner, who you see about any medical concern. And then they refer you to a specialist. So most people don't see a gynecologist on a regular basis, which actually can be, a real way of opening up the conversation, talking about contraception, talking about other issues to do with your sexual health, your reproductive health, having your smear test, etc., and generally being kind of much more open to having those kinds of conversations. The other reason is that the kind of, the cancers themselves really are underfunded and underprofiled compared to other cancers. So even if you just do a very straight comparison with breast cancer, for example, breast cancer at one time was very difficult to talk about, which is why we have things like the Pink Ribbon campaign, which is, ubiquitous around the world now, and it's become much easier to speak about. But that took quite a time and quite a lot of work of the research community coming together, people affected by those cancers speaking out, a lot of powerful brands coming on board. And you can't underestimate the power of beauty brands, for example, taking on something like the breast cancer message and making it much more kind of everyday, much more when you walk into a store, you see it, you make the association. And that hasn't really happened yet for the gynecological cancers. And that's why we're working so hard on making this conversation an everyday one and one without embarrassment.
It's astounding. I mean, that's what we're trying to do here at Scarlet Society, is just make gynecological health, sexual health a part of everyday conversations.
Everything.
Everything. I'm 41 years old, and I feel like I finally maybe have permission to start saying vagina in a conversation. And maybe I got that permission a couple of years ago, which is ridiculous.
Yeah.
And you bring up such an interesting point, Athena, is we sometimes have these alternate names. And that starts really young, too. I mean, these kind of goofy names. And then there's shame encased around that. Don't say the real thing. Don't say penis. Don't say vagina. Don't say anus. And I think that perpetuates an issue. And
Absolutely. Using proper anatomical words is really important. I mean, okay, if you're, language, people don't speak the same way in front of their grandparents as they do in front of their friends. And that is understood, that you might at home use euphemisms and nicknames for things. But if you don't know, it comes up again and again through the research that we do with clinicians. They find it really hard when someone comes in and will only say down there, or will talk about their waterworks when they're not talking about their waterworks at all. They've got a pain in their pelvis, or they're suffering from bloating, or they've noticed that they've had a skin change on their vulva, but they cannot say the word vulva. It makes the whole dialogue with your medical professional really, really difficult when you want to take all of that out of it and just be able to talk about your symptoms, whether it's abnormal vaginal bleeding, whether it's about discharge. These are the kinds of changes that you need to be aware of. You know your body, and what you hear continuously from people who are diagnosed with cancers at a late stage is they've recognised something was wrong, and if they have managed to go to the doctor, they've found it really difficult to describe, and then they've had a poor conversation, and the doctor has just said, take this cream, come back in 3 weeks, come back in 6 weeks. And you have this continuous cycle of people sometimes making 5 or 6 visits before they're actually examined properly and diagnosed.
So I want to get to some of you have an an awareness campaign at the Eve Appeal. And I know you also have a test you can take too. How well do you know your vaginal health, your vulva health? And I took that test this morning. Um, but specifically starting out let's talk about preventative care. What what should we be asking our doctors? I know this differs here in the US. Obviously, we don't have access to healthcare as we do, unfortunately, as people do in the UK. But that's so interesting to hear, though, that it's down 30% in the UK, which is just because I want to think, oh my gosh, I want free screening so badly. I would kill for that here in the US.
The global statistics around cervical cancer deaths are horrifying. And that's because there isn't a cervical screening program. It's a cancer that affects younger women. And the World Health Organization actually now has a global eradication campaign because it is an eradicable disease. You know, we really should be preventing every single case of cancer that we can. And we have that power with cervical cancer.
So, talk to me about preventative care, Athena. What should we be asking our doctors? I want to go back to the pap smear too, because
Yeah,
that's one word that we all know about. And what
yeah,
does the pap smear cover? And kind of a checklist for people listening if
yeah,
when they
yeah,
go to get
sure.
their care.
Yeah. So, what you should be aware of, and obviously your body changes with life stages, but you should be aware of your hormone history. You should be aware of what contraception you've used, when your period started, how regular your periods are. You should be aware of your bleeding, and you should be aware of everyone is aware of kind of checking their chests, checking their breasts, but do you know what the skin on your vulva looks like? Vulvas all look completely different, and that's normal for them to look completely different. But do you know what yours looks like and what the skin looks like? So would you notice if there was a skin change? Do you know what your pelvis feels like and what it would feel like if it was bloated? So one of the key symptoms of ovarian cancer is bloating, and that can be confused with so many other things, IBS and celiac disease, and there are lots of reasons why we're bloated. It's quite specific with ovarian cancer. It's bloating that doesn't come and go and lasts 2 or 3 weeks or more. So you are bloated for an extended period of time. In terms of what you ask your doctor, you should go to the doctor whenever you notice a change to your bleeding, to your discharge, and if you have had any abnormal bleeding. Now, abnormal vaginal bleeding, obviously, people have, different period cycles, etc. But that's bleeding after sex. That's bleeding after menopause. No amount. If I could get people to take away one single message, it would be no amount of postmenopausal bleeding is normal. There's no last hurrah period. You always need to be checked by a doctor if you are menopausal, which means it's been a year since your last period. That's what the definition of being postmenopausal is. And if you bleed after that point, it's not normal. You do need to be checked. It may not be cancer, but you do need to be checked. In terms of what you ask your doctor in relation to HPV and your pap smear. So HPV, have you been vaccinated and should you be vaccinated? So in many countries, and the UK is one of them, the HPV vaccination is part of the school's immunisation programme. So you're vaccinated at around 12 or 13 within the school system. It is efficacious to have it done later on. And if you haven't been vaccinated or you missed the vaccine for whatever reason, that is something you should talk to your GP about. It's also quite easily available, freely available privately. And that's something that you can consider. But your first port of call should be to your GP, who will talk through your age and whether it's still worth you being vaccinated. So being protected against HPV is really important. HPV is a really clever, pretty evil little virus. We will all come into contact with HPV if we have any kind of sexual contact. So not just penetrative sex, not just cis sex, any kind of sexual touching, any kind of genital touching, you may come into contact with HPV. It's a really commonly occurring virus. 80% of us will come across it. Most of us just flush it out. It's like any virus. We wouldn't have any symptoms. We wouldn't know anything about it. For some of us, it stays around our bodies and it becomes a risk factor for cancer. And that's why the pap test is important, because the pap test does two things. You do it it comes into kind of two stages now. The first is to see whether you have active HPV and whether it's one of the strains of HPV, because there are many strains that can cause cancer. And if you have, you're asked to come back again for a subsequent appointment. And also, if you're HPV positive, you are referred to have the cells on your cervix looked at to see whether there have been any cell changes. Now, even if there have been cell changes, it still doesn't mean you have cancer. It means you might have precancerous cells, and those can be dealt with and those can be treated before they develop into cancer. HPV has no gender. It's not just that boys and girls can contract it. It's also that it's a risk factor for other cancers. So the throat and neck cancers, which I think about 90% of those diagnoses are actually male, HPV is a risk factor. It's one of the risk factors for vulval cancer. There are lots of good reasons to protect yourself and to understand HPV. So one other thing that you should be asking your doctor is not just about the vaccine, but also about where you are in your pap screening. And every country has a different kind of timeline in terms of how often you're screened, but sometimes that's every year, sometimes it's every 3 years, and we're just moving to every 3 years actually in the UK. But the important thing is that you are regularly screened, and you should be screened right up until the age of 65. We get some extraordinary and really upsetting phone calls to our Ask Eve nurse service. So, for example, people who have been for their cervical screening, they've been for their pap smear, and they found out they're HPV positive. And that really concerns them if they don't know anything about HPV and they understand it to be in some, a sexually transmitted disease. And we get questions like, does this mean my boyfriend's been cheating? Does this mean, I should be questioning my husband? And it doesn't mean any of those things. HPV can live in your body for a long time, and it could be to do with an encounter you had 20 years ago. It really, really doesn't have anything to do with how many sexual partners you have had, and that can be really upsetting for people and just adds to the stigma in a kind of very different way, which is really upsetting.
And I'm glad you brought that up as well, too. But just to reiterate, how you call it sneaky, how sneaky HPV is. For somebody who may be wondering, well, Athena, I've had sex, but I've always used protection. I've always used condoms. I've been really, really safe. I imagine you're still at risk. Everyone is at risk.
Yeah, I mean, it will be low risk, but you are still at risk. Condoms don't cover the whole of your genitals, and HPV can be spread from skin to skin contact. That's the truth of it. And and then if you think about other forms of sexual activity, whether it's oral sex, where you may not be using condoms, there are all sorts of ways that HPV can be transmitted, unless you are a very well kind of behaved nun or monk, and you don't have any form of sexual activity. You are very likely to come into contact with HPV in your lifetime. You're also very likely just to process it like any other virus and it not have any impacts on you. Unfortunately, for some people, that is not the case, though.
Going back to the stigma again, have you found, is there any way to kind of lessen the sting for some people? So if going to the doctor feels like you're kind of encased in shame, or you're just nervous, or you don't even want to talk about it, are there any talking points or kind of a buddy system that you felt that has helped to encourage this? Because again, we want to start talking about this. I want to scream it from the rooftops. I want to go and take all of my friends and accompany them to any care they need. But how can we start talking about this and helping people in a way, extending on all the work you're doing to break this stigma?
I mean, I think that's a really good question, and we one of the things that we've done, I'll send you some links to some of the resources, is we developed a set of conversation starters. So questions like, about when was your first period, and, tell me a story about that. So that it makes it easier to talk to your friends about it. The other thing that we always say to people, we produce some kind of top tips for going to a gynae appointment to make it a gynecological appointment to make it easier for you. And one of the things that we do say is, if you would like to take a friend, do take a friend with you, because that can be something that helps some people. Do think about what you're going to wear so you're really comfortable. There is nothing worse than someone who has no idea what cervical screening is going to involve, turning up for their cervical screening appointment with a jumpsuit on that only does up the front, with very little underwear on underneath. So they're basically, they're naked on the bed. Whereas if they'd worn a skirt and they just needed to take down their underwear and jump up, and they'd have felt much, much more comfortable about it all. It's an absolute truth that knowledge is power. So the more you know and the more you find out, the more confident you are about talking about these things. And that's a really, major way of overcoming the stigma. And then normalizing these conversations, normalizing them with your friends, normalizing them within your family. And it's never too young to start, with your with children, really thinking about and agreeing with all the people who are part of that child's life. How are we going to talk to them from the point where you're changing their nappies, and so you're not pulling faces, and because your body language is part of shame and stigma as well. If you can't sort of talk about things without visibly flinching, I saw someone in a corporate meeting that I was in a couple of days ago. He visibly flinched when the word menopause was mentioned. I mean, it was just, and he really didn't mean to, but he clearly, there just wasn't part of his language or a conversation that he had ever been used to having. Well, he's got a mum who I would pretty much guarantee has probably been through the menopause, and it needs to be a conversation that's had. It's often the way. So when you ask about how do we get people more comfortable, it's often the way that people use the Ask Eve Nurse service. So what they'll almost do is use it like a run through of how they're going to talk to their doctor. So, they will ring and say, I think this is a symptom. Do I describe this, and what should I be asking for, and should I mention, is there one of the cancers that I should mention as a particular thing that I'm worried about. And I think that it is that classic knowledge is power thing, but we do need to make these conversations every day, and we do need to make sure that we go into kind of the retail spaces, the commercial spaces, the workplaces. Lots of employers are very worried about the well-being of their staff and supporting their staff well-being, whether it's about nutrition or heart health or mental health, stress. We need to talk about these issues as well. They will have probably 50% of their workforce who are menstruating. Talk to them about periods. That's a really important thing. That's a really important thing to do. And you have to think about all of the different ways that stigma are compounded. And one of them is, you go into, pretty much any supermarket in the UK. I don't know if it's the same in the States. I bet it is. And you go into any pharmacy and there's a whole aisle that's dedicated to feminine hygiene. This whole range of feminine hygiene products. You don't have masculine hygiene products. And all of these things compound the kind of idea that somehow women's bodies are the dirtiest, smelliest place on earth, and they're not. These products aren't necessary. It's washing with soap and water is as good as anything. And in fact, a lot of feminine hygiene can be very damaging because, your vaginal biome is very important. It's very protective. It stops you getting infections. A lot of the over-counter things that you can, you're almost disguising symptoms. We often find that people who have had vulval cancer symptoms for some time have been using over-the-counter things for either sort of mild diseases like thrush, or they thought they had UTIs, or they've been using feminine hygiene products thinking, oh, I just need to disguise the smell or the skin, or it's really, all of those things really add to a sense of stigma and shame.
And Athena, here at Scarlet Society, we really we want to talk to every woman, every non-binary individual, of course,
Yeah.
anybody who's interested in
Yes,
their
absolutely.
anatomy, their anatomical
Yeah,
health, and their sexual health. But
exactly.
specifically for individuals, non-binary individuals, trans men, women over the
Yeah,
age of 40, is there anything
yeah.
specific that 40 plus women that you'd like to say and that we should know?
Yeah, well, I mean, if you look at the data around these diagnoses, most of them, the majority of people who are diagnosed are postmenopausal or just in that sort of perimenopausal phase. I mean, one thing that's really important is so important to be fiercely inclusive about about these issues and communications around them, because if you have a cervix, it needs to be screened. So trans men may have had top surgery, they may have had some element of bottom surgery. They probably haven't had their cervix removed. Trans women, by contrast, probably haven't had their prostate removed. So, they need to be aware of the signs and symptoms of prostate cancer and make sure that they're alert to any changes. So it's really important to be inclusive, to make sure that particularly people from communities with the highest barriers to accessing healthcare and health services, that they feel supported, that they know that they can ask for a smear test if they haven't been called for one. Sometimes it can get really lost in medical systems. If you've changed your gender and you're now identifying as male, for example, you may be taken off the list for certain tests. So to really make sure that you are being checked for everything that you should be being checked for, that goes for breast screening as well. Obviously, if you have you are now identifying as a different gender and you've changed that on your medical records, etc. Really important for you to take support with you into the room and to feel really comfortable about the process. So one of the things that makes people feel really comfortable is if they've seen the equipment, they know what a speculum looks like. They maybe held a speculum. They can ask their nurse or their smear test, their pap screen taker, whether they can guide the speculum in, or help them guide it in, so they feel really in control of that whole process. And then I think the most important thing is to always be able to say stop or no or that's hurting, if it is. And one of the things that we try and educate both doctors and patients about is that there are many people who have been affected, for example, by sexual trauma, and to always check with people first. So before doing an internal examination, not to say, have you been subject to sexual trauma, but to say, is there anything I should be aware of? This is what I'm going to be doing. Is there anything I should be aware of that's happened to you? Or, do you want to tell me anything, before I begin? This is what I'm going to be doing. And that really kind of helps people of all ages, particularly people who are, in their 40s, 50s, 60s, who, want to feel in control of that in that situation.
That's so powerful because so much of the time, and I know I can speak only from my lived experience, but you feel out of control. Sometimes you feel like a number. Sometimes you feel like you
Or you
can't
can't
speak
say
up
no.
or
Yeah,
you can't say
yeah,
no. And I
yeah,
appreciate you saying that so much, that it is to
yeah,
remind everybody it is your body at the end of the day.
yeah,
You are going for your care, love yourself, have integrity
yeah,
with yourself, and to know that you can speak up and
yeah,
educate yourself too and say no if
yeah,
something doesn't feel right. Or
yeah,
Athena,
absolutely.
thank you so much for all of this.
Oh, no,
This
thank
has
you.
been above and beyond a wealth of information. For listeners, again, the Eve Appeal, how can we support your work? I know you work with a team of scientists, of researchers, of warriors really across the globe. How can we find your work and how can we support you?
Well, head over to our website, which is eveappeal.org.uk. Follow us on all of our social channels. We have a really, really fantastic, particularly our Instagram feed is full of information, really empowering, upbeat, really insightful. We have a lot of downloadable resources. So we've got a lot of resources around HPV. We've got tailored information for non-binary and trans men. So if you need specific information, please do come to us. We've also developed some easy read information. There's a large audience of people affected by learning disability who are often excluded from a lot of kind of sexual health and gynecological health information. And I think it's really important that we reach them with information about cervical screening, etc. So we've got tailored information for those groups as well. But at Eve Appeal is the social media handle across all of our channels. And so do follow us and support. And we're a charity, so fantastic if anybody wants to support the world-class research that we carry through, and the nurse service, which is, a much needed, free at the point of use, and most importantly, taboo-free service.
Well, your work is tremendous and so needed. Athena Lamnisos, thank you so much. Thank you for taking the time. I've learned so much in this conversation, and I hope it's one of many conversations.
Thank you so much for listening to today's show. Your support means so much to us, and I hope you got some great value from today's episode. If you're looking for resources from today's show, or you'd like to join other women just like you, looking to explore their sexual health and wellness, visit us over at scarletsociety.com.